Good morning, my dear friends. Today in this video, I'm talking about John Milton and his work is Paradise Lost. This is your third unit and this is for the MA previous students. As you know, John Milton, before going to this epic, it is very essential to know something about the poet. Some dates are very important in Milton's life. He was born in 1608 in London, and in 1653, it's the tragedy of God that he lost his eyesight. When he was writing Paradise Lost in 1667, he got he narrated this poem to his daughter, and it is his daughter who wrote this poem. In this way, we find that in 1677 or before that, he has completely lost his eyesight and he was not able to read and write. But he wrote great epic in 1667. It shows that he was very intelligent person by birth. He was a poet, and without any efforts, he wrote such a beautiful epic of English literature. In 1671, he wrote Paradise Regained. In his last work was Samson Agonist. These are the best works of his life: Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and the Samson Agonistes. These are the best work for which Milton is known. But in spite of that, Milton is known for his sonnets also. For example, you have read in BA second year On His Blindness. On His Blindness is one of the best sonnet by John Milton. So, before this, we should know what type of poet he was. Milton as a poet. So, Milton poetry is inseparable from the Milton as a man. What I mean to say by this point is that Milton poetry reflects what type of person he was. It means his poetry is very much subjective. By reading his poetry, by reading his sonnet, and even by reading Paradise Lost, we find that we have the glimpses of what type of person he was. So Milton poetry is the Milton as a man. Then we have humanistic and the Puritan concept, Puritan influence on Milton. He was a humanist. He wanted to write for the welfare of human being. He has great faith in human life, and for this he is called a humanist. Again, he is a Puritan. Puritan is a person he was Puritan by his theory and ideology. He asked questions to the religious, political, and the other type of institutions of his time, and even in Christianity, even in church also, he asked questions. He raised objections by various forms, by arguments, by participating in various meetings, agendas, by arguments, by God's opinions, and by the pamphlets and by the letters. He wrote all this. So, from his poetry, we find that he was a great humanist and he was a great Puritan. Then we find that he was a strong lover of liberty. He believes in the liberty of man. Liberty of man's the liberty of political liberty as well as the liberty of opinions, liberty of the approach, liberty of outlook. In his poems, he asks questions. He makes arguments even with the God, even with the political system, even with Christianity. So he was a great lover of liberty and the liberty of man. Milton believes in the noble conception of the poet's vocation. He believes that the poets are extraordinary people of society. They are extraordinary people on earth. So he has a great respect to the poet vocations. That's why a poet should have a pure and the honest life. He should have a very chaste life. So because a poet has to do a lot on this earth. They are blessed people. They are blessed by the God. They have extraordinary qualities. That's why their life should be also very high as compared to the common people. Then we find that he was greatly influenced by the spirit of Renaissance spirit, that the adventurous things from the different, as we have done while doing Shakespearean comedy, The Twelfth Night in Unit 1 and in Unit 2, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and this is your third unit by the John Milton Paradise Lost. So we find that what is the Renaissance spirit, and in his poetry, we find the Greek classical influence. He has read great writers of Greek literature, and we have Latin literature. He was a great lover of Latin literature also, and in his poetry and even in Paradise Lost, we find this influence. Then he has the influence of spirit of reformation. We find in his poetry that the spirit of reformation means logical and a rational outlook on the affair and the institutions. Rationally, he thought about what type of changes is required and what is good, what is bad. And logically, he discussed all these topics. So we find the spirit of reformation, and in this way, he brings reform into the humanities, for humanities. Then we have his intelligence and his imagination was influenced by the conflicting principle in politics, in religion, and social life. His social life was very much influenced by that time. Politically, he was very much influenced and he participated in social and political life, and his imagination and intellectual, he was a born poet. He has that imagination, and because of this imagination, he wrote Paradise Lost, which is a very difficult work to write. But it is because of his intellectual and his imagination that he is writing, he was able to write Paradise Lost. And this conflicting principles, his Puritanism, his humanism is reflected in this book. Then he depicts the spirit of inquiry and the spirit of rational analysis, as we have already discussed, that he has the spirit of reformation. And this reformation he wanted to bring out by the spirit of inquiry and by spirit of rational analysis of every topic, not only religion, not only politics, not only social topics, all type of topics were discussed, were analyzed by Milton, and this is reflected in his poetry. Now, the qualities of Milton poetry. His poetry reflects the personality of the poet, as the poet Milton as a man, as I have already discussed in second slide. So when we read his poetry, we find that he is very politically he is very pessimist. He is not satisfied, but he has great faith. He has never lost his faith in the God. So his personality is very clearly, very effectively reflected in his poems. His poem shows his classical and the poetical blend of mind. He was very much influenced by the Renaissance, classical literature. So his poetry reflects, his poem shows classical and again Puritan, because his mind setup was rational, argumentative, and this makes him puritanical blend of mind we find in his poetry. His experience in the versification and his skills use of speech, figure of speech shows his originality. He took blank verse for writing Paradise Lost, and he adopted the device of sonnet also. And in this way, on all this, we find that it is spontaneously coming out from his mind. He does not put an effort to make his poetry beautiful. So we find the original speech, original shows in his poetry. Then in the fourth point we see his style of writing score him an inch into the mansion of English poetry. It is because of his originality, it is humanism, his rationality, his argumentative spirit that he is able to have a very wonderful place in English poetry. Now, the Milton conception of poetry, what the Milton feel about the poetry. In this slide, we will discuss about it. So, the first point is, like Aristotle, he has a very high notion of poet's calling. He believes that poet can do miracle into the society. Poet is the extraordinary person. They are blessed people by the god, by the goddess of muse. So, they should have a very honest approach, honest life. So he has a very high notion of the poet's calling, poet profession, their vocation. His themes of poems is purely religious and moral, dwelling on the crime and punishment, sin and suffering, a struggle between the good and evil. What is we find in Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. We find the same spirit in many other points. The same spirit we find in Milton's Paradise Lost, in many other poems also, sonnets also. So often the theme is related to the religion and moral. And this religion and moral is developed through the conflict between the good and evil. He believes that the purpose is not appreciation and the delight, rather he sees aesthetic joy in poetry. Milton believes that, as Wordsworth says, that the poetry is for inspiration, for appreciation. It is not for. He never adopted any king and the queen of his time to appreciate as a topic of his poetry. He believes that poetry is not for the appreciation, rather it has a religious values, moral values. So the poetry should be ethically, it should be very strong, it should be very high. The poetry is not for not for entertainment, it is not for only for appreciation, it is not only for delight, as the romantic people believe, romantic poets believe. He says that the poetry should be very high, ethical, it should be full of moral and the religious value. So the language of the poetry should not be very simple language, it should not be the language of common people, it should be very high language, and the topic of the poetry should be very high. Poet is an inspired, he believes that poet is an inspired creator, and the aim of the poetry is quite high and the idealistic. So the poets have very high position in the society, they are very blessed people, and it is their duty to write the poetry which is very high and the idealistic. It should be moral, it should be ethical, it should have aesthetic values, the topic should be very high. He had great belief in the divine muse, the goddess of poetry, and that's why in the beginning, in the first 26 lines of Paradise Lost, he tried to evoke the divine. He makes a prayer to the goddess of poetry to make him to complete this great assignment which he has in his mind, to glorify the way of God to human beings. Now Milton's poetry has some limitations also. And we find that some limitations, we find that his poetry, as he believes that the poetry is not does not have entertainment value, so sometimes we find that his poetry becomes very difficult to understand, it becomes very complicated. So we don't find enjoyment, or we don't find the relaxation as we find into the poetry of Wordsworth, poetry of Keats, poetry of Robert Browning. The same thing we don't find in Milton's poetry. Milton regards poetry as a reflection of poet's personality and character, and in this way his poetry becomes subjective. As I have already told, Milton says that the poem is the reflections of poet's personality. And because of this belief, his poems become subjective. Then sometime it appears that we are finding only Milton in his poem. It is the outlook of Milton only that he is trying to depict in his poem. But as the other poet believes that there should be some objectivity and the dramatic poems are there, as the romantic people believes that, romantic poets believe that the poem should be objective. There should be some, no doubt poems can be subjective also, but there should be some objectivity also. And that sometimes poet tries to enter into the minds of the character to depict his opinions. And kids call this quality negative capability, as I have put in my slide, that this negative capability is not found into the poetry of John Milton. Sometimes we find that this is the limitations of Milton's poetry. So the third point is that there is a gulf between his theory and practice. Theoretically, we find that he is very idealistic, he believes in humanities, and he glorifies the ways of God towards humanity. But practically, we find in Paradise Lost, mainly in Paradise Lost, that he seems to be in the favor of Satan, not in the same favor of God. So sometime we find that he is trying to glorify Satan. And when we discuss the question, who is the hero of Paradise Lost, we find that Satan is given extra attention as compared to, extra emphasis as compared to God, Adam and Eve. So we find that sometime we find that there is a big gulf between the theory and practice. And his poetry might get more appeal if he had been more of an artist than a politician and Puritan. After reading his poem, some critics realized that if he had not been a Puritan or the politician, he might have been a great artist. Because he was a born poet, he was a born intelligent person. Whatever he write, it was not the efforts, it is fluently coming out from his mind. So he might have been a great poet if he had not the influence of politics or the Puritan concept, Puritan ideology, that the rationalization and the argumentative spirit. If he does not have that, if he purely might, if he purely might have been a poet, he will be more lover, he will be more lovable as compared to the poet at present we have. But these are the rare limitations of the poet. Otherwise, Milton is one of the great poet of English literature. In our next slide, we will talk about Paradise Lost. I hope you might have the glimpses what type of poet he is. Before starting any book, before starting any work of art, it is very essential for the students to know about the writer, about the author, and what type of outlook he has. So, in this slide, I am talking about Milton as a poet, Milton as a person, Milton death in his lifetime, and the political and the social condition of his time, the various influences he has on his personality. And in the next slide, we will find that how Paradise Lost was written and what type of influences we find in this poem. Thank you very much for this. Bye. See you in next slide.